Egyptian mythology, there's the Abdoad, I have no idea how it's actually pronounced, but it's 8 creatures from that were there at the beginning of the world, and they gave rise to life on Earth. And in Christian thing, you've got the 7-headed dragon. Most of the mythologies have some kind of dragon thing, so I wanted to use the dragon to kind of build all this stuff on. So I took that Abdoad, changed the spelling and pronunciation, and made it 7 dragons instead of 8. So it kind of touched on the Christian dragon thing, but it still had the weirdness of the Egyptian thing. And there was more of that kind of stuff. There was more mythology. It was like than real Lovecraft. But certainly Lovecraft was an inspiration for that kind of feel.
Earlier, when you were talking about the movie and your sort of relationship and your process in helping make that, you said something really revealing. I'd like to hear you talk more about that. Which
remember.
was no. It was something that I'm really adamant about myself. Is what you called your version? Well, the comic version of Hellboy, the real version. So could you talk a little bit about comics as a medium? Because you choose to work in that medium. What does it do that, say, film doesn't do? That sentence and paragraph writing doesn't do? That all sorts of other mediums don't do? Why comics in particular?
Well, that's a pretty huge, topic. One of the things that my pet peeves these days, working with artists, I don't run into this myself, but I know Scott runs into it, and we commiserate about it, is artists who get hung up on film rules. And it's not a film. These things of, you can't turn the camera more than this many degrees.
Yeah, has anybody heard the 180-degree rule of comic storytelling? It's a film rule. It doesn't apply to comics. It's people trying to understand comics through the prism of something else.
There's so many things about comics where you can reference film, and you say, the camera's here, or the camera's this, or the camera's that. The trouble is that people take that too literally, because there's just a different set of problems when you're making a film. There's logistic problems, and there's disorientation kind of problems and stuff with filmmaking that don't exist in comics. Because comics, you've got a page, it's laying there. One of the big differences with comics is you're able to look at an entire sequence of events without them actually moving. It makes certain things much more difficult to do. Having the monster pop up out of the dark and surprise you is really hard to do in a comic, because that's why I do a lot of page turn gags, because the closest you can get to that is turning a page and going, holy shit. The reader didn't flip through the whole comic like almost everybody does. Flip through the whole comic and go, okay, now I'll read it. Now that I see that the monster pops up on page 8, I'll read the comic. So it's just a whole different set of problems. With comics, you're composing, if you're a good comic book artist, you're composing a page as a piece of art, not just as a series of panels. If you really want to be literal about doing it like a film, then you would just cut it up into a grid and you'd say, look at this picture, look at this picture, look at this picture, look at this picture. But if you're playing with the medium, I do a lot of stuff on a comic book page where you kind of read across, and then the action goes down here, but the action that's running down this side of the page is happening in a parallel time. There's a lot of experiments you can do, because you do have an entire page of panels to play with. And with film, you're limited to, that's your frame. I remember working on the Hellboy film and saying, can we do this, can we do this? It's got to fit in the 185. It's got to fit in this frame. So if you want a tall, thin panel, well, you can't do it. Anybody else?
I have a daughter who's at SBA studying cartooning. What advice would you give to somebody in school, and what advice would you give to someone just starting their career in comics?
That's the kind of stuff that's hard for me to say, because the business is so different now than it was when I broke into the business. So you'd be better.
Yeah, school programs that teach comics, I think it's great that there's so many now, but she's only going to get out of school what she puts into it. She can diligently do her 3 years at SVA and not be remotely equipped to go out into the work world. So she just needs to drive herself really hard and not assume that her teachers are going to drive her hard and that her teachers are going to, teach her how to do it.
You always get that situation where there are guys teaching this stuff, but maybe they did it 10 years ago, or maybe they never did it. And I had a teacher like that in art school who really wanted to be a comic guy, and he taught certain things about how to do comics. There were nothing, it was him guessing how comics were done.
Yeah, school's a great opportunity to really be able to focus on your work, and aside from that, it's questionable what you'll necessarily get out of it. But entering into, trying to enter into the market right now, the first question I ask anybody when I'm doing portfolio review is, what do you want to do? I look at their work to try to figure out where they're at and ask them what they want to do. And they, so often they're just like, well, anything. I'm like, well, I'm not offering you anything. You gotta, in school, coming out of school, trying to break into the industry, having a really clear goal and tailoring yourself for it is important. If you're somebody who's like, well, I just want to tell stories with pictures. Okay, well then, that's kind of a different career path than, well, I want to get paid to pencil Spider-Man. I want to sit and draw somebody else's stories. There's usually more money in it if you are successful in getting that job drawing Spider-Man. At least there's more money in it starting out than I just want to tell my own stories. So, but having that clear goal and being realistic about it and looking around the industry and being analytical about what opportunities are out there, how do I fit into what's out there?
There are so many other opportunities, now than there were when I did it. I mean, when I did it, a few guys were doing their own stuff. Most of us went in saying we'll draw Marvel DC stuff, and then maybe eventually we'll figure out something else we want to do. But the conventional wisdom was learn at the mainstream, learn at the majors, and pay your dues, try to make some kind of name for yourself, and then once you've got some kind of name for yourself, a lot of other opportunities present themselves. But now, I go to a small press convention, and you see there's this whole wonderful thing, this whole, at least a generation, if not two generations, of guys who never had any interest in doing mainstream comics, and they're doing really interesting work. Hellboy, started as a very mainstream comics because I was coming out of 10 years of doing mainstream comics. So there's a lot more opportunity. You need to explore, you need to go to shows, you need to look at what people are doing, you need to be realistic, is this guy making a living happen? And if you don't plan to make a living at it, there's a lot more opportunities,
No, but that's a real thing. Like a lot of people in the industry, they work doing some other job, and comics are a small part of what their work is. And
which is the truth of people who write books.
Yeah, that's
how few people, you may have all their books, and they may have 20 books in print, but you may find out that guy's got a day job.
Yeah.
Because so many of these guys, and it was a big eye-opener to me, that how few of these guys can actually make a living doing this stuff. It's one of the questions I used to always get, especially from parents. It's do you have another job? Do you actually, make a living doing this? Because it doesn't seem like something you make a living at.
First time I asked Matt Wagner, he was like, working on Sandman. He was thriving. I met him at a shop. I was like, so do you make a living doing this? And it was funny. He was at the top of the game, and I wondered at that point. But yeah, a college student should use college also to get knowledgeable about the industry.
Well, to me, I went to art school, and I went as a general illustration major. If I had it to do over again, I would have gone in as a general fine arts major. And I did my schoolwork. And I did painting, and I did light drawing, and I did all that stuff at school. The comic stuff is stuff I worked on in summer, I worked on the weekends, and, I never took a class that was specifically geared towards doing comics. That's the stuff I learned by studying comics and by going to shows and talking to other professionals. So, the beauty to me of art school or any kind of college is getting a broader range of stuff. If you just go and learn to draw comics, it is kind of limiting.
What do you think about the fact that there are courses for comics?
I think it's fine. If I was in college and I was a general art major, sure, I'd take a class on drawing comics. the thing that I'm